So, Simon, the obvious question is, why loneliness?
I was here this morning at 9, no one was here, so I kind of performed loneliness. So I was wondering, like 10 days ago, I was wandering over a graveyard in the south of Germany trying to find the grave of my great-grandparents. And I didn't find it. Turned out that the administration of this graveyard messed something up and they just threw away the gravestone. They kind of threw something up in terms of organization, payment, whatever. And I was kind of overwhelmed by my feeling of hurt that this stone is gone and the written names of the stone, which kind of tracks back my family, are gone forever. It was a strange feeling because, I mean, you could say a stone and, you know, some name of it, why does it, you know, has such a meaning? It's like a flag, you know, why do you have people, why do they project some sort of significance to it? And, but it was a feeling of somehow loneliness and cut out, like something was cut from the past, like from present to the past. And then I was wandering a little bit further in this graveyard and I came to this section where there are graves which document very short periods of life, children graves. And there was this one man sitting on a grave which documented the life just 10 days, like a baby who died. And I watched this man there for over an hour, just sitting on the grave, kind of couldn't get away from this grave, was the father of this baby. And I somehow asked myself, okay, I wanted to react to this, and I couldn't find words to kind of react to this situation. And in some strange way, I had the feeling that the only way to tackle, talk, or, you know, handle loneliness is probably that you imagine that someone else is also lonely. So not language is the means to kind of talk about loneliness or to give comfort, but just the imagination that it's something that we all share, we have all in common. There's not so much we have in common, but loneliness could be something we have in common. So this is the idea for the title, and in some ways for me I wanted to make a point with the title as well, to say that loneliness, in spite of what we all hear, read and see in the media, for me is not a political problem. You know, you have all these tendencies to have ministries of loneliness, you have, you know, political parties who integrate that now in their program. You know, it's the big health issue of our times. We need to tackle loneliness with political means. You know, we have to stick together. So they misuse it in some ways as a political theme. For me, it's an existential dimension of life, and it's not a political problem. For me, it's not even a problem, I would say.
Yeah, it's meant to be an epidemic, something that is contagious. You reminded me of a time that I spent in sort of cemeteries, which always just visually look almost like libraries to me. And to see the scripts on the headstones in particular typefaces or sort of particular sort of designs, which sometimes come to seem obsolescent or sort of old-fashioned, and nature and the weather is eroding them. There's sort of teenagers graffitiing over them, they're neglected or they're not neglected. And then there's the sort of secret language, right? You're talking about the language of a shared glance. And somebody that you know or that you don't know, and you're looking at each other, and there's a kind of commiseration or a kind of openness, and a kind of sort of community of, well, of what? It's kind of sort of mysterious what you're all feeling. But these are really valuable sort of places, not overdetermined, not overscripted, not necessarily emotionally signposted. I guess why I was delighted to think about loneliness and language. I was, and I'm sort of thinking about some of the other speakers over the last couple of days. I was always struck by that line from Salman Rushdie, where he talks about to migrate is to lose a language and a home, and thinking about just getting older and things that lose, things that smudge and that sort of fade. And for me, I always had this sort of sense that I was losing my parents' language and that they were losing their language. They speak a fossilized form of Punjabi, which is in no way kind of contemporaneous. And I was also thinking about the Werner Herzog film, in the Land of Silence and Darkness, which I don't know if any of you have seen. It's about people who are deaf mutes. And many of them were regarded as educationally subnormal. Many of them were kind of kicked out of their houses and just lived in kind of cow sheds. There's a key figure, Finny Straubsinger, in the film, and when she was 8, she was a little bit of a naughty child. She just sort of fell down the stairs in the building where she lived, banged her head, had some headache, but it was fine. But slowly, incrementally, over the next few months and years, she lost her ability to speak and to hear, and she was bedbound for 30 years. And so she missed out on World War II, as it were, and missed out on sort of social worlds of reconstructed Germany. And by the time she was able to sort of learn a bit of sort of sign language, the German that she spoke or that she could remember was already anachronistic. And she goes around talking to people or touching people, smelling, reassuring them, clutching them, people who've experienced the most bleak isolation and ostracization. It's an incredibly mysterious film because it's not about disability. It's not about social care. It's not about kind of practical things which will make sure that people in these kind of situations get the services that they need and they desire. It's just a moody, meditative film about wanting to speak or wanting to hear and not being able to do so. But it also, we live, I don't know if it's a version of this. Many of us have been thinking about communication, isolation, loneliness because of COVID. And I'm talking about it as if it's happened in the past, and that's kind of unclear. How did you experience language during COVID?
Yeah, I mean, in the end, for a lot of people, that was the only thing which was left, no? They were at home, isolated, and so they talked or wrote language. For me, in some ways, when I reflect about this parallel between loneliness and language, I don't know, we all know this situation when we talk on the phone. We don't do it that often anymore, but from time to time we talk on the phone. But also in a chat. It's always the question, who ends it? And for me, this is, interestingly enough, one of the most distinctive moments when I feel lonely, when a telephone or a chat ends, It's a strange thing, sometimes you say, okay, I have to hang up now. But normally it's a question of who is giving a little bit more the lead in the ending of a conversation or a chat. And for me, loneliness has something to do with this hanging up, of this breaking this talk, of interrupting it. So in a strange way, language causes loneliness because it stops at some point. You can't continue the talk forever because this would be the only way to stop loneliness. It stops at some point, and then this is the greatest moment of you're thrown back to yourself. You feel maybe this is the last time you talk to each other, So in some strange way, and also in this COVID pandemic, yes, we were all connected through the social media and through the means of communication, but the feeling of being alone and thrown back to yourself was even greater through these communications, I had the feeling.
You reminded me of time that I spent with switchboard operators who worked for a suicide crisis line, and they're up all night, and people call, and sometimes which is a big thing to ask for help or to say something about themselves, but then they can't say anything for whatever reasons. Maybe they're drunk, maybe they've fallen asleep. But the job of the person picking up the phone is not to put the phone down and just to say calmly, with certain kind of rhythmic regularity, I'm here. If you want to speak. And there's other people, there's never enough workers, and there may be lots of people wanting to call that line. So how do you do the cost-benefit analysis or speaking to nobody for an hour. But they get it really good, they say, about hearing the silence and different modes of silence. And they can see or feel when it's kind of pregnant with potential. And sometimes it may take 25 minutes for somebody to say something. And sometimes it may take 45 minutes. And sometimes they do much later on have encounters with people who called up and they said, no, we couldn't speak, we didn't want to speak, but you picked up and you didn't put the phone down. I could almost hear your heartbeat, or I could hear your breath, and that itself was a kind of sort of lifeline.
Yeah. It's a paradox, you know. I mean, in the end, to see the possibilities of not being lonely sometimes makes you even lonelier. No? I mean, this is the paradox we all share when we're here in a group and we have a dinner and we sit together. I mean, this is the classic moment, and you would say, okay, no one is lonely, but funnily enough, sometimes when you're in big groups, when you're like seeing people have conversation, when you see laughs, you feel the most lonely, the loneliest. And this is obviously a romantic tradition to not neglect this. And this is, for me, this is the most important point, maybe the only point I want to make in this parallelization. The great writer Leopardi, who lived in Recanati in the Marks here in Italy for whole of his life, because he was disabled, he couldn't really move, he was a very ugly man, wrote the most incredible love poems, but just always sat on the window. Very important, for me, a very important metaphor, the window, for the relationship between language and loneliness, because he was seeing through the window, on the streets, and he saw on the other side of the street a woman, and he never met her, but he wrote the most beautiful poems for her. And he said, one of the most powerful sentences in this context, he said that loneliness kind of makes you young again. Like when you feel lonely, you always come back to a state of youth, because you start to become creative again. You start to imagine again. So it's a force, it's something which really, really is important for the capacity to imagine a different world, a different feeling. So in some ways, it's the precondition of a good life, I would even say. And there's the tradition of vita contemplativa, and I don't want to go into the philosophical side of it, but just in terms of creativity, just in terms of consciousness, this feeling of being on your own and to imagine something else. This is key, especially in our times where we are so distracted and we have the feeling that the status are our social networks.
I spent a lot of time looking out of windows during COVID and listening, because it seemed preferable to being on a screen where the language, as I remember it, was you're on mute. Unmute yourself, or you're breaking up, and it did indeed feel like we were breaking up. But to the horrible tinny acoustics of Skype or Zoom, it felt like a sort of simulation of communication, and it made me think about smell and about heat and about touch and the surround sound, not just about sort of semantic content. But I think like a lot of people, as there were streets and spaces were hollowed out, there was a kind of retuning or a kind of realignment of my ear, and I found myself, as I was going out, just listen, or on the window, just listening to breezes, listening to wind, listening to birds. They had a lot to say, and I can think how they're so uproarious, they're so noisy, they're so chatty, they're having a party seemingly. How could I not hear them? What are the other things that I can't hear in society when things are functional, or things appear to be functional? I remember one homeless guy going past, just off his face with misery, just going, social distancing? People like us have been social distancing forever. And I miss that. So as society supposedly normalizes itself, again, I think my ear, my capacities for communication are being kind of blunted.
Yeah. And I mean, what you describe is exactly, in this period of time, and I fear somehow we lost this capacity. We kind of, had a new capacity to look at each other, to long for each other as well, And sometimes I have the feeling that, we think that not being lonely and being, in a community and having lots of social connections, that is the ordinary. So the other, like loneliness, is the extraordinary, and this is the sickness of our time and stuff like that. But this is completely ahistorical, and it's also, it's stupid in some sense, because it's the other way around, To be lonely is the ordinary when you look at the history of mankind, and to be not lonely is extraordinary.
Yeah, I don't know why, but I feel a lot of the work that I've been reading in the last few years, which have been most moving to me or compelling, are about muteness or about splendid isolation. And there's a great book by John T. Claypole, who was director of the arts of the BBC, and it's partly about his stutter. And it's a history of the stutter, or the glitch. But it's also, to be a bit reductive, it's about the anti-TED Talk. And the TED Talk stands for clarity, transparency, communication, connection, what he calls hyperfluency. These are all sort of commendable things. In many ways, we work really hard to get good at it, but it's something that he struggled with. So he talks about tics, he talks about aphasia, stutters. He also talks about how you mask this, and writers who've masked speech disorders, which, and you can imagine he's uncomfortable with the idea of a sort of disorder. He looks at Wittgenstein's stutter, Henry James, and the ways that does word substitutions or dramatic pauses or different forms of circumlocution, which we think of as kind of hallmarks of the Jamesian style, but at one level are just a set of kind of really sort of creative strategies for dealing with his complete social uselessness in many ways. And I was also reading this great book by Hamza Hassan called Shy Radicals, and he also has autism, and his brother was almost sent to Guantanamo Bay, and he creates this fantasy utopia of, it's almost like the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy Dreams, and for him it's a place called Aspergerstan, where he's not interested in an intifada, he wants an introfada, and instead of having a militant fist, people who want to belong to the introfada do this. And again, it's a kind of manifesto, humorous and really sincere, about shyness, about awkwardness, about quietness. He also talks about something that I know you've written about, which is how even places that we think of as kind of important for ideas, learning, communication, like libraries, are reinventing themselves as different kinds of noisescapes, as places of co-mingling. He says, what I need most in the world, and people like me, where there's so much noise in our head and we're often struggling, we need cemeteries, he says. We need community gardens, we need libraries, we need the quietness. This is almost a biological and a neurological necessity. And even in the places where you thought you would get these, you don't get them so much.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the few groups which don't really have a political representation, the shy people. We kind of look for all different groups to protect, but the shy people, they don't really have an identity politics for them. So I would underline this. And I mean, you can put this whole theme obviously on the tableau of change of our communication system. We look so much for functionalized spaces and for language and communication, and also interaction is so much functionalized, capitalized, you could say. And so, I mean, I think of the talk we had in the morning yesterday here on this stage, and it was very impressive. But it somehow, by looking in this traditional way, looking for differences between AI and human beings, one could maybe say loneliness is one of the few things which really differ us. The AI probably is not lonely. And so maybe this could also become really a means of protection. To have this as a human being, to have this feeling of loneliness, could protect you from the world of functionalized communication.
Because the system wants us to talk. It doesn't care what we talk about. It wants us to chat. It's doing the web crawling. It's doing the sort of the data scavenging, and it just the churn of it. And so sometimes not talking, not giving it just more stuff, more content, is. And I was thinking about this. About the melancholia of sort of writer friends of mine, and they often sometimes say, the whole of the 20th century writing, thinking, trying to put things on. What was it for? Just so that Axel Springer could sell all of his stuff to ChatGPT. I know the BBC are having conversations about this. The archive of our dreams, of our fantasies, of all our music, our melodies, our visual sort of languages, all just cannibalized, commodified, spat back to us. It's sometimes you're sort of crippling, or you just want to refuse it.
Yeah, and one could also turn it around again and say, the precondition for writing is this moment of hanging up with something else. Because, I mean, you get inspired with people, you know, you talk, you have interesting conversations, and you have the feeling in this moment, the book is already there, or the art is already there. But then it's not, you know, you can't really work together on an art piece. In the beginning, I mean, at least in my experience, you really need to have this feeling of being on your own, alone, even hurt in some ways. Then you can come to a form of language. Then you can start to express feelings, because in the end, you know, this is all about language. You know, it's a bridge, a little unstable bridge to express some sort of what's in the inner of yourself. You know, and no one can really help you with this.
Yeah, but in addition to being on your own, I think about the decline of chewing gum sales in supermarkets, because, you know, you're out there, you're waiting there, you're waiting to pay. There's a sort of long line. You're a bit bored. You nag at your parents, and now I'm told by people whose job it is to increase chewing gum sales, you're on your phone, and you're not looking around you. Just as you go into a building where I live, all the students and the adults and myself, the moment you go into the elevator, you dive into your phone, not to engage with other people. You're not necessarily even doing anything or looking at anything really, but you're using this as a sort of device for self-protection, some kind of experiential hygiene. The language, it almost sort of seems to be, but then again, you get it as a kind of performative model in galleries, in art spaces, where we're almost reinventing the wheel. It's the art of a conversation. Now it becomes a genre. We're going to have 24-hour longer interviews. We're going to, we'll do a kind of greatest hits of Muhammad Ali being interviewed by some such. But this is the old knowledge in itself, but we've become, or it seems like we've become disconnected from it. I mean, we're chatting and we're talking, but it often seems a kind of depressed conversation. I think about Mark Fisher, who talked about not interactivity, but about interpassivity. You know, we're watching a football game and we're also on a device. We're with our mates, and we're on sort of WhatsApp. We're chatting, communicating, but it seems not to bring that much of a sparkle or a joy. But you can't live without it. And I notice in classes when I ban devices, students need the device just to touch. It's almost like a limb. It's become so sort of crucial. How do you? Is this a losing battle? The battle for isolation or for disconnection?
And I mean, what you're saying is, I think we imitate the conversation. We imitate all the time now, no? We imitate conversations, we imitate expressions of feelings, and that is obviously because we are surrounded by so many pictures, motions, reflections of it. And I think the crucial question is, do we find a way to come back to the importance of language as a real source of integration, you know, for human beings? And that would obviously depend on what, you know, reflect again more on words we use. You know, we had this topic a couple of times during these days. You know, how is communication something beyond reflection? How are you? I'm good. You know, these kind of, and this is something which obviously the social media and our you know, the necessity to be even quicker with reflections and reactions obviously harms. But in my ideal world, we would take much more care for the words we use, you know. And loneliness, again, can be a starting point to reflect on what can words mean. And I personally don't think that words or language can deconstruct loneliness, but at least it can describe loneliness, you know. the thing what I said in the beginning with the father on the grave, I mean, everyone has a feeling to it. There's no, and it's like transcultural, transmilieu, transnational, it's great, no? This is really a situation which everyone can attach to, whether he is a millionaire or a bus driver. So this really is a powerful means language has to describe loneliness. But like I said, I don't think it is, you know, the normal therapeutic answer would be talking is enough to not feel lonely. And I don't think this is true.
One of the things that I find very positive, that seems a bit reductive, is, and especially with younger people that I meet, their openness to talking about languages beyond the human. And obviously there's more and more people interested in sort of forms of the alchemical, the occult, communicating with the dead or those who are undead, but also, and I think this is going to come up later today, about the languages of plants, the languages of viruses, the language of other species. And, you know, we mentioned the kind of Copernican sort of revolution, thinking about depedestalizing human beings as kind of communicative sort of agents. And maybe it's impossible, maybe it's just a thought exercise, sort of zone of speculation, but I think it's quite kind of productive to imagine that the polyphonic spree of entities and forces that we can barely sort of describe with our sort of human language. Do we want to hear what grass is saying to us? Do we want to hear what plants think of us? Or maybe do we want to hear that they're completely indifferent to us? What do rocks want? What does geology want us to tell us? But I think these are political questions as well.
But also existential. I mean, the only answer to the artificial intelligence could be the imaginative intelligence, the emotional intelligence, but also like to imagine something which is not, you know, measurable. This could be the only really productive way to counter it. No, and me personally, I also think that we need to, as humans, we need to really see what our capacities are. And one of the best proofs of our liveliness is to our creativity, our imaginative system, basically. So I think this was the clock, which says it's 10 o'clock.
Well, we could, I mean, maybe at an end on a I don't know if it's a bleak note, but I would want to sort of flag up the work. I think they're international, the Endangered Language Alliance, run by a really great person called Ross Perlin. And again, the analogy with species loss and ecodiversity. There's about 7,000 languages in the world, about half of them may or may not see out the sort of 21st century. He talks about killer languages, almost like killer species, whether they're English, and English is one of them, but sort of Chinese, Spanish. Nepali apparently is gobbling up lots of sort of languages. And he talks really interestingly about space and language as how people migrating to cities in an increasingly kind of urbanized world. The city sometimes contributes to the deformation of kind of existing language groups, but also act as a kind of extended arc, as a home, a hub, where we can sometimes hear them, where they can be logged, preserved. But he also points out, again, like nature, most of languages in the world, there's no dictionary, they're not on censuses. Sometimes there's, you know, barely a few dozen people sort of speaking to them. They don't seem important, just like those midges, those insects. We'd be happy to do without them until we realize that their disappearance affects us all and damages us all. And so this question of sort of cities as places of kind of useful, energizing, creative, existential babels, and how to preserve the babel, and at the same time preserve the right to silence, the right to be incommunicado, which is not the same as non-communication. That's what I'm hearing for you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, maybe this is then a good endpoint because we are here, not in the city, and you know, maybe this whole theme of loneliness and language has also something to do with our way of lives and our, you know, the future possibilities of living, and maybe the city is something of the 20th century, you know, an integration sphere of the 20th century, whereas, you know, the countryside, something, you know, a little bit distant, is the integration sphere of the 21st century. Why? Because the communication systems somehow come to an end in the face-to-face idea. In the cities, we could live next to each other, but we don't know our neighbors anymore. I mean, that is the paradox of our time. You know, people live very close together, but they don't know about the feelings of people who live just 2 meters away. Whereas when you're not living in the face-to-face society, but on the countryside, maybe you have more capacities to imagine what people 1,000 kilometers away feel, you know, and so this could also, be a starting point for a new emotional intelligence, I would say.
And I'm thinking also about Marcus's walk sort of yesterday, which is partly about thinking about the ear, how to retrain the ear, and is an ear just something that you have on the end of your face, or could your whole body be an ear? How could we become a different kind of sort of sensory organ which absorbs and understands and sort of processes our experiences, the ground beneath our feet, the other sort of volatilities? And I think a number of us have been talking about not just speaking, but about listening, and how to not just be like that.
Thanks so much, Sukhdev. Thank you.